found the book amazing. It's so interesting. It's so well written and very revealing about his work, his life, and the difficulties of being an architect, the successes, and the people that he's worked with, and the style that he has in terms of working to try and fulfill the needs of the people and society at the same time. And it talks about his determination. I mean, he's at the top of the ladder in terms of architecture. He's had to have been made of steel, because it's a difficult profession. There's a lot of confrontation. There's a lot of competition. You have to be very competitive and creative and hardworking and resilient, and he's all of those attributes. And I want to just touch on his childhood to show you at the very beginning what he was made of. He was a very independent young boy and very spirited and rambunctious, and he was interested in making models all the time in school and projects, and he was into, as a matter of fact, he had a project of bees in school, and he brought the bees home, the beehives, and he worked on those beehives, building and watching the social work of the bees and the building of the cells. I mean, that was sort of an inkling. It showed us what was coming for Moshe Safdie. They lived in Haifa. The family was there until after the war, and they came to Montreal in the 50s, early 50s. But before they came, his parents were very smart because they wanted to ease him into a new culture. So they went to Europe for a number of months, in Italy, Rome, Paris, London, where he took to all the art and architecture. It was very, it had a lot of effect on him. And I mean, even in Israel, he spent time going to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and noticing everything around him. So I just was, from there, he went to Montreal, went to McGill, graduated from School of Architecture, and worked on this project of habitat. He was always drawing boxes in school. Noticed all his designs, fixing the boxes, and eventually his project was accepted. And it was a lot of hard work. It wasn't easy to get that project accepted. It's all in the book. And again, I urge you to read the book. It's marvelous. I mean, the people he's met, the work he's dealt with, the top artists in the world. He's international. He's an international famous architect and has reached the pinnacle. And I would like to just tell you about the awards he's received. He's gotten the Order of Canada, Gold Medal for Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, an American Institute of Architects, National Design Award for Lifetime Achievement by the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian, and the Wolf Prize in Architecture, which is equivalent to a Nobel Prize. So at this time, I'm going to hand you over to this great guy, the giant of architecture, Moshe Safdie.
Thank you, Farla. Thank you for your kind words. Your introduction is, in a way, is a springing point to the memoir. But a word, good evening to everyone who I can't see. Just a word about the memoir. Why the memoir? It's been brewing in me for some time. I thought that my 60 years in architecture are an experience that if I could share it, it would become very enlightening to people, particularly lay people, about what architecture is all about. And throughout my life, I'm always asked I'm told by people actually, I know nothing about architecture, but, And that but follows a series of statements about whatever any one of you might think about architecture. I thought that sharing the experience of why and how we do buildings, what motivates us, where the inspirations come from, what the influences would be helpful in understanding our profession. And so COVID came, and I sat home with my wife, and I said, now is the moment. Uh, and so I ended up doing my memoir, and Michal, my wife, ended up doing a cookbook, the recipes of our mothers. The book begins as Farla told us in my childhood in Israel. I refer to it because I think the influences of growing up in Israel in its idealistic days of the making of the state were very formative on me. My parents left in 53. It was a shock. We're very unhappy about that. Ended up in Montreal, in part because my father was inclined to go to Brazil, where all his family from Syria emigrated to. But my mother said, if we're leaving, it'll be an English-speaking democracy. And ironically, we end up in Quebec, English-speaking Quebec. My father was actually educated in French in Syria, so it was good, okay for him. I went to Westmount High, and towards 2 years, the graduation, they gave us an aptitude test. I was going to go to a kibbutz when I was in Israel with all my colleagues from the youth movement, but being a farm in Canada seemed a little far-fetched for me. And the aptitude test said, excels in mathematics, good in the arts, suitable for architecture. And that's how I ended up registering to McGill Architecture, which turned out to be an amazing, wonderful experience. The School of Architecture was in its heyday then, small classes, only 16 of us. And towards the end of the school year, there was a scholarship offered to go and study housing in North America, one student from each school in Canada, which I joined, and I came back and said, I've got to reinvent the apartment building. People live in the suburbs because they hate apartment living. If you could design apartment buildings that they feel like houses with gardens and privacy, then the exodus to the suburbs might not be so extreme, and we might have urban living again. And that led to my thesis, at which point I'll switch to images to give some form to what I'm saying. And my thesis, which I called a building system, consisted of prefabricated modules, boxes, as Farla told us, which were set into a frame, each having a garden on the roof below. Next, I made a model that showed how this would apply on a large scale on the slopes of Mount Royal. And at that point, after graduation, I had the good fortune to get a job with Louis Kahn, the great American architect in Philadelphia. But after a year of being there, my tutor, Professor Van Ginkel, came to Philadelphia and said, we're going to have an expo in Montreal. I'm in charge of making the master plan, and I want you to come and head the design team to do the master plan. And in my chutzpah of a young person at 22, I said, I'll come back, but I want the opportunity to apply my thesis as a potential pavilion for the expo. And he said, well, what you do with your free time in the evenings is up to you, by all means. And so I returned to Montreal, and 1963, 64, 65, produced with a team the master plan of Expo, which most of you, I'm sure, were there, at least who were around in 67. And in parallel, at night, we developed this model, which was the whole Cité du Havre being a community of 1,200 families on the principles of habitat. We took this to Ottawa, to the cabinet, Lester B. Pearson, Prime Minister, and they looked at it and they liked it, and they said it's very interesting. but we don't have the time nor the funds to build this whole thing. There's $15 million, do what you can. And after being shocked and saying I'll do nothing, I came back to my senses and I built the section that you see on the top left-hand side, which is the reduced habitat, the 159 units which were built for Expo with the funds that we had. Next, please. Next. Go back. So that's the model of the reduced habitat of 159 units. It wasn't the entire concept, but it did demonstrate the houses with gardens and streets. And that is me just about the time when we went to Ottawa to present this to the cabinet. Next. The next few years were very lively. We had to finish by 67. We had to build a factory. We devised ways to cast the boxes, pre-finish them in the plant, lift them into place, and have the building partially occupied by Expo and partially open to the public. And for the Montrealers, I don't need to say that it's still there, and that it's now a heritage building declared by Quebec as a heritage building, which is protected by the government.
Wow.
Just a couple of images of the building today. Next. The greenery. There's a lot of old timers who still live from the original, or their children from the original opening. And the building has proven to be a place of community. Now, right after that, we could keep going on the slides, please. Next. So, back too fast. Right after Habitat was finished, there were many commissions. Habitat Puerto Rico on the top left, Habitat Israel on the right, Habitat New York. None were built. For the next few years, there were several designs commissioned, but because of difficulties, technical, otherwise political, they didn't get built, which was a painful kind of coming to the senses after the great triumph of Habitat. Next. I didn't get any habitats built in the 70s and the 80s, but, and I'll come back to it, we were involved with institutional projects around the world, but around the year 2000, we decided to return to the subject of housing, and we, through a fellowship in the office, we said, let's design habitat as we would do it today, with the greater densities that have evolved in mostly Asian cities, but all over, much greater densities and mixed use complexes. This is one of the studies that we did. Next. Another one, there were several, and on the right, you could see the many, many models that were made as part of that study. All these led in recent years to realizing projects in the spirit of habitat. This is in China, 3,000 units in the city Qingguangdao, a beach city near Beijing. Next. In Singapore, a complex called Sky Habitat, middle-income housing, not in a luxurious site, and actually filled with families, and there are 3 levels of bridges with playgrounds and amenities and swimming pools and lots of community space. Next. And in that period after Habitat, with no habitats getting built, I went back to Israel for the first time, actually, for an architecture conference that took place in 1967, right after the Six-Day War. The city became united. I met Teddy Kollek, the great mayor of Jerusalem. We fell in love with each other. And he commissioned me to restore part of the Jewish Quarter, to do the Mamela area, which is outside the city walls, and to do plan for the Western Wall Plaza. And on condition that I open an office in Jerusalem, which I did, and have one to this day. This is the first building to be built in the old city, the Yeshivat Porat Yosef, which overlooks the wall, where it developed a language that tried to relate, could you go back, please? Try to relate to the fabric and language of the old city. The rabbis, when they interviewed me, asked me in a threatening voice, will you make a modern building for us or a traditional building for us? And my answer was that if I succeed, they won't be able to tell the difference. They won't be able to answer the question will become meaningless. And indeed, this is a combination of using massive stone walls in the tradition, also as required by law in Jerusalem, and a very lace-like precast concrete system of arch-like spaces within. I also developed a plan for the Western Wall, which proposed to dig down the area of the praying by 9 meters by 30 feet to the level of the Herodian Street where it was originally, which then would create this amphitheater of terraces rising towards the Jewish border. And that plan was presented with a lot of fanfare and went through public hearings. You can see here the Herodian Street becomes the praying area, and each subsequent level, as more and more people accumulate for different events, would be able to accommodate the 150,000 people who sometimes gather there. But because of a lot of conflict between the religious ministry, the archaeologists, and other factions in government, Israeli coalition politics, nothing took place, nothing occurred there. The area to this day is kind of the accidental leftovers from demolishing the Mughrabi Quarter. Unfortunately, I would not say that the area is currently very beautiful. Next. This is a photograph of my presenting the model to President Katzir, the President of Israel, with Teddy Kollek on the right side. Another area that we worked on in Jerusalem, and I dwell on that, the work in Jerusalem was very important in terms of my architectural development, because it was the first time that I had to deal with the architecture of belonging. How do you make a project, a complex, a building, or neighborhood that belong in a city with a very rich architectural heritage? And Mamela, which you see here as it was in 67, most of it a slum area because it was a no man's land between the Jordanian and the Israeli cities, became an area of designated renewal. And it took 40 years between the day I began the master plan, got it approved, modified it, adjusted it, and went through all the cycles of opposition of various sources. I won't go into the details, but I'd say religious opposition to projects that had any commercial activity in it by the city walls, conservationists, because they didn't believe that a project of that scale could have a harmonious character with the old city, and so on and so forth. But working through with a developer, Alfred Akirov, who proved to be very courageous, the project eventually opened about, I think, 38 years after we began it in 72. It's today the heart of the city. It creates a lively connection between the old and the new city. And it's the one place in town where secular and religion, tourists, Israelis, and Arabs of all persuasions all mix and gather there, as it is the bridge point between all the different communities in the city. Next. Also in Jerusalem, right by Mamilla is a Hebrew Union College, again developing an architecture language which is harmonious with the architecture of Jerusalem. You see there the King David Hotel and other buildings, and the whole theme of building in the traditional stone. I regret to say that today things have changed. Unfortunately, Teddy Kollek is not there, and there are many 40-story glass towers getting built all around Jerusalem, which I think we will live to regret. But that's the subject of another 1 hour talk at some other time. Next. Next. Yad Vashem followed, where I chose to build the entire complex in concrete. I felt the building cuts through the mountain underground. I'm sure many of you have been there. I won't go into the detail other than to say it's the most emotionally wrenching project I ever did. It took 10 years, and working with the building committee, with several of the survivors, was very intense. And the one thing I would mention is the idea that at the end of the experience, you emerge to light and to life. There's that sense of optimism. We prevailed. Here we are. It was a very controversial proposal, and it took several months to convince the committee that it's appropriate to end it with this kind of optimistic return to light. Next. The Jerusalem experience really had an impact on my approach. So when it came to the National Gallery in Ottawa, a competition that took place in the early 80s, I was determined to kind of create a building that sort of was in dialogue with the neo-Gothic architecture of Parliament and the city and the cathedral next to it. And so the building became a kind of a crystal cathedral, a glass building, extremely transparent and inviting. We called it the extrovert building, with a variety of galleries for all the different collections. And there was this conscious effort to try and make a building that is Nordic, is appropriate to the coldest capital in the world, actually. Ottawa is colder than Moscow and is the coldest capital in the world. The ramp leading up to the Great Hall. And the Great Hall that's become the place of many ceremonies, including the heads of state dinners, etc. I won't go into the galleries and the approach to daylight as let's continue. Coming out of Yad Vashem was a project that you unexpectedly came out of a visit of the chief minister of the Punjab, who was in the center of this picture with the orange shawl, who came to Israel on a state visit, saw Yad Vashem and asked to meet the architect. And so here I was, after I met him, he said, "We have suffered a great deal like the Jews have. I'd like you to come and design our national museum in a holy town by the name of Anandpur Sahib near Chandigarh." And so 2 weeks after his visit, I was in India on the site. Next. And again, I'll skip 10 years of very complicated circumstances, beginning of the design, election takes place, the chief minister loses, a chief minister comes in, about to cancel the project. I managed to convince him to continue. He does continue. 4 years later, he loses the election, and the original Mr. Badal shows up and cuts the ribbon. So the political complexities of projects of this scope are really part of the memoir in terms of what it takes to get consensus. But here's the project that it was completed. Galleries telling the story of the Sikh people, spanning across a valley that has become a series of water ponds, which is very much part of the Sikh tradition. The bridge connecting them to the town and to the other section of the museum with the auditorium and library. And the exhibits were all designed by a team of Indians at the Indian designers, that design institute that we worked with. Next. Which you see here in the interior, very beautiful, handcrafted by craftsmen from all across India. What I'm trying to show in these projects, which came after Habitat, while we could not do any housing, is that these institutions, one, in different places, in different programs, each evolve with its own architectural solution that are unique to the place. So this is a Skirball Cultural Center and Museum in Los Angeles, a Jewish institution which actually is open to the public at large and encourages that. Museums, conference centers, and place of a lot of events. Quintessential California, with a lot of courtyards and action in programming in outdoor and indoor spaces. Luckily, the fire did not go beyond this hill. The building was not damaged in the recent fires. And quite a different setting, culturally and otherwise. We go from Los Angeles to Arkansas, to Bentonville, where for Alice Walton, who grew up in Bentonville, in a family that created Walmart, decided to build a Museum of American Art on the family estate near the so-called downtown of the small town. And we dammed the streams coming down the valley in the tradition of the mill towns, and the mill towns which are on the water for power, and created these ponds around which a cluster of pavilions of galleries and libraries and other programs surround. The entire building is built with timber from the forest of Arkansas pine, and concrete walls. And here are the contemporary galleries. We are now expanding the museum. It's a great success, and so we're almost doubling its size to open next year. And again, in the Midwest, the Kaufman Performing Arts Center, an opera house and dedicated opera house and a theater, a concert hall under a unified roof with a singular public lobby. This is a view from the downtown. This is a view from looking over the city, the place of arrival under the cables which hold up this glass structure. And next, and the public mixing between the two halls in a common lobby, and the concert hall, which is said to have the best acoustics in the United States, designed by Yasu Toyota, who also did Disney Hall in Los Angeles. And most recently, a medical school, the Einstein Medical School, for the Einstein Hospital, which you see in the background. And the building with the 3 domes is a medical school in a very busy, noisy part of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And we created this internal garden with a lot of breakout areas and common working areas, combining the research labs of the hospital with the medical school, so that researchers and the medical students all mix together and rub shoulders and learn from each other. And you can see here the breakout areas where the students are able to work together and gather between the classrooms and the labs in the building. Now, a major change in our practice occurred, again, originating in Yad Vashem, ironically, I would say in this case, where on the opening day of the museum, which was, I think, 2005, Sheldon Adelson, who was one of the major donors to Yad Vashem, approached me. We were all rushing to the bathrooms after a very cold night with the long speeches. And he came over and he said, you've done a nice job here. I'm working in Singapore with the government. We're competing for a project that will be an integrated resort of hotels and convention center and theaters and shopping and a casino. And are you interested in joining us for this competition? And I thought he was joking, but 2 weeks later I was in Vegas and there were 4 months left to design this building and present it, including printing books and models and so on. I told him I'd have to mobilize my entire office, which we did, and competing with four developers in total from all around the world, each with their own architect. We won it. And we won it based on a few ideas, one of which is proposing that the 3 hotel towers be crowned by a sky park, which would have all the kind of resort elements, the swimming pools and the gardens and restaurants and observatory, thus freeing a lot of the site. And also that it would have a series of public spaces open to the public, the shopping arcade opening to the bay, combining indoor and outdoor spaces, animating the whole waterfront. And it's been extraordinary success, commercially and otherwise. And it's changed our practice because all of a sudden we had many commissions for very large scale projects in Asia, from China, from Sri Lanka. This is the Art Science Museum, which was in the program given as a site for cultural building. We had to designate what kind of cultural building. And it said it should represent the spirit of Singapore. And we decided to opt for art science as a theme for the museum, since Singapore actually had both the science and art and aquariums and everything you might, concert hall. So this seemed like something new to offer them. Next. A view of the Sky Park. We are currently working on a major addition. There's the Sky Park with the observatory and the restaurants and overlooking the city. We're currently expanding this with another tower and music arena and other facilities towards the back of this picture on the south side of it. Next. Next. One of the commissions that we received right after from a Singapore developer, Capital Land, was a very large 10 million square feet project on a very historic site in the city of Chongqing. Now, I'm sure many of you don't know about Chongqing. It's the biggest city in China. It has 33 million people. It's inland where the Yangtze River meets the Jialing River. And at the point where the two rivers meet, it's called the Emperor's Landing, where the city was started and born. We built this project where 8 towers form a kind of a metaphor of a sail ship in a way, with a conservatory that spans across 4 of the towers, with gardens and restaurants and hotel lobbies, etc. This is really mixed use, apartments and offices and hotels and shopping and subway station. and it kind of anchors the city at this point towards the south. I'd say it's the equivalent of Lower Manhattan for the city, and with all the cruise ships that go down to the gorges also docking around it. And last project I will show you, which is still in the Far East and in Singapore, there was a competition for building a new center for Changi Airport to connect the Terminal 1, 2, 3, and 3 that are forming the airport in the center of what was a parking lot. And it had to accommodate airport facilities and shopping, but they wanted it to have unique attraction. And we proposed a magical garden, which would then be under this great glass dome, which magically will be floating as if defying gravity, draining the entire roof when it rains. And in Singapore, it almost rains every day, and it rains with energy. Would be drained through the center in sort of a waterfall that comes right into the heart of the building. And thousands of trees would form the garden, which under them all around has some shopping. But the garden in itself is a major attraction. 70% of the people coming here are Singaporeans who come for the day with their kids. The train that connects the terminals goes right through. You can see it going through the building. And this now has become kind of one of the lively destinations. I'm told it's the most Instagram building in the world. So I'll say in conclusion, what if I have to summarize, I would say there are different periods in one's life, but coming overlook with a view to looking back, we've had the good fortune to come back and implement some of the ideas of habitat on a bigger scale in commercial projects, which was so difficult to do in the 70s. It's also become now mainstream. A lot of the young generation of architects have embraced habitat. There's one going up in Toronto by Bjorke Ingels, the firm Big, and he calls it Habitat 2, Ode to Habitat, Habitat 2. I think it's already constructed in Toronto. So it's interesting to look back at what were controversies at some point, and then they become mainstream, and other ideas which, like postmodern architecture in the 80s, which now looks like a bad joke that's gone away. I'd love to have a conversation and hear in what way you might want to elaborate, opinions or questions. Let's turn to our audience. I'm not sure how we, yeah.
I think, hello, Moshe. My name is Julia Grisovitz, and I have been given
Hi, Julia.
Great pleasure of thanking you, which I will do towards the end of the call. But today I'm also going to be the question master. So we received a number of questions, and I'm going to try to weave them together with a few that I have integrated into this. And I guess I'd like to start by asking you the following question. Here it is. When you were thinking about leaving Montreal for Harvard in the late 1970s, Professor Solton, who was teaching at Harvard, told you that you absolutely had to come and take up the position of director of the school because the profession was in danger from those who treat architecture as a purely visual exercise like painting. What do you think is the biggest risk to architecture today?
Thank you for a great question. I'd say, let me start by reflecting on 1978, when Harvard invited me to come down. It was a big decision for me personally because I realized you could not do this commuting. I'd have to go to Boston, and which means relocating my office, which was also a major task. But I did feel, particularly in 78, 79, 80, that architecture was in a terrible crisis. That this notion of what we came to call postmodernism, that architecture is a visual thing, you design visually, you don't have to solve all of humanity's problems. The social agenda that modernism attempted to address are not problems for architects, they're problems for politicians. If I know I'm oversimplifying, but I'm doing so to give the essence of what the mood was. And so I did feel it was really important to devote time to education because I felt, particularly Harvard being a very important school, would have enormous impact. When I got there, I realized that the task was not very easy because there were several entrenched faculty who are very much for for the ideas of postmodernism, which was the mainstream of what the profession was at the time. And after 10 years, I actually departed, in part because I felt I would do more good in my practice focusing on it than on teaching, given the academic politics that took place. The president of Harvard asked me, "Are you doing so are you leaving out of protest?" And I said, "No, 10 years is a good time to make a change." But in fact, since you asked me the question, I felt that it was not a friendly thing. Now, your question for today, what about today? Things have changed, but some things have become more permissive. I think the danger of architecture today, particularly with computers and all the 3D stuff that we have and work with and so on, is the permissiveness that there is in the profession, that a lot of leading architects allow themselves to be sculptors and do some wild-looking buildings, some of which are exciting looking, but really at the expense of addressing the program, addressing sustainability, addressing not thinking in terms of what would be the human experience in the building, but what would be the wow effect, if I can use a term that every client asks you today, where's the wow? Where's the wow effect? That's the problem of architecture. Wow is not necessarily very livable.
Nor very long lasting, perhaps.
Yes.
Here's another question. Okay, so what is your favorite spiritual project? And in so framing the question, I leave it to you to include any of your religious projects, no matter what denomination, shall we say, or religion, and your memorial projects as well.
So you're talking about my work?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I would have loved to say that Porat Yosef, the yeshiva that I did with the synagogue within it, was a project that rises to the occasion. Unfortunately, as I say in the memoir, the rabbis turned out to be the worst client I ever had. And they didn't complete the building. And so at this point, they occupied it half finished. So I can't include it. But I'd say spiritual buildings, Yad Vashem is not a worshiping building, but it's certainly a sacred place and a sacred building. I would start there. I would say the chapel, multi-denominational chapel at the Harvard Business School, is a building that I think allows almost anyone of any persuasion to worship or to memorialize as all these events take place there. Recently, I designed a mosque for Dubai that has not yet been built, but I was very proud of reinterpreting the ritual of Islam in a very contemporary way. And I've recently designed a synagogue for Marienbad in the Czech Republic on the site of a synagogue that was there and was destroyed on Kristallnacht in 1938 and stayed vacant. And I'm hoping very much that we'll be able to begin construction on that very soon.
Thank you. I'm looking at these very many questions that are flying at me from the chat and the ones that I have gotten from before, and I'm struggling to make certain I give everyone a moment to ask the questions that are on very much at the foreground of their thoughts. So I have a question for you that is going to sound a little bit puzzling, but it's certainly something that I think is an interesting change in the last 50 years. Norbert Schonauer, who you, I'm sure, remember as being, for those of you who don't, a professor of architecture at McGill. He was a Romanian architect, Hungarian, yeah. And he once said to me when I was his student that in the 1950s, Jewish architects in Canada were marginalized, and he was not Jewish, but he was a man who was an observer. And he said the Jewish architects in Canada were only solicited to build small apartment buildings and modest commercial centers and occasional shopping malls for Jewish developers. Louis Kahn might be considered to be the first Jewish architect of the last century who really began to have commissions that were of international importance. And what do you think has happened, and what is your explanation for the explosion of Jewish star architects on the international scene in the last number of decades?
That's a mystery. Let me just say that before Louis Kahn, of the previous generation, Eric Mendelsohn. Yes. He did a lot of buildings in Germany before he left. He then did some great buildings in Palestine at the time. He then came to America and built some synagogues and so on. But Louis Kahn, for sure, was one to sort of, we didn't call them star architects at the time, but he certainly was a star. Although I should emphasize it for Louis Kahn, he struggled through 30 years of being an architect, doing houses and a lot of theoretical plans. And the first building where he got recognition, he was 55. And what we know of Louis Kahn was done between 55 and he died in his 70s. So it was a very late blooming practice. But it is fascinating that we have Richard Meyer and we have Frank Gehry and we have
Libeskind
and Robert Stern and
Eisenman, Richard Meyer, and we could keep going, yeah.
So I would say,
and you,
that we can't look at it in isolation. There are a lot of great Jewish writers in those same years. We take for granted that a lot of great Jewish scientists in that period. I think the barriers for Jews to be architects and getting work that were certainly there, I'd say, up to the 50s or 60s, because architecture was very much established as kind of an establishment profession, WASPy, I mean, even in Montreal and so on, that the barriers came down, and like in many fields, it just became Jewish talent was able to flower in architecture. It probably was there, the potential was there before, but too much inhibition to pursue it. I know that when I said I want to be an architect, my father said, "What do you mean? You have to come and help me run the business and take over."
Actually, this ties into perhaps the youngest question we have, or the question by the youngest participant in this discussion tonight, who says, Liel says, "I'm 12 years old and thinking of being an architect. What made you want to become an architect?"
So as I told the story, I wasn't sure about what I wanted to be. And certainly when I was 12, the idea of being an architect had not even entered my mind. And when I did decide to go and study architecture, I had never visited an architect office before, or I don't think I even met an architect, to be honest. But I loved sketching and designing little things like cars. And when my parents took us through Europe on the way to Canada, I was 15 then, and we visited Notre Dame and the great cathedral in Milan, and the various palaces and Versailles and so on. Something clicked in me. I was very moved by I remember particularly being moved by visits to the islands and the lakes north of Milan, like Stresa and so on, where these palaces that rise out of the water like island buildings, and thinking, what a terrific way to build on the water. So, which I still try and do. So I think there was this love of buildings that was in me, but it was not articulated enough. And so I am very impressed when someone 12 tells me they want to be an architect. And my advice is visit architects' offices, understand what's involved, read the memoir, it'll help to understand what the profession is all about. And if you have a real passion, because without the passion, architecture is just too difficult. It doesn't make sense, architecture, without the passion. It's tough. It's tougher than being a lawyer, tougher than being a computer scientist. There's disappointments. But the rewards when you finish a building and people move in and you see happiness on their face, nothing like it.
Yeah. I have two short snappers for you, and they're in some ways, they are either side of the coin. One person has asked, do you have a favorite architectural work that you have designed? So your favorite.
I have 4 children.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah. And so I would say I can name half a dozen buildings, but I can't. I'd say Habitat, it's the most radical, and I will never be able to repeat the kind of extraordinary break that it achieved. National Gallery, I think, was a very important building for me in terms of understanding the sense of ceremony of a public place and a public building. Yad Vashem, for its obvious. And I have a soft spot for Crystal Bridges, as it was my 20th museum, but it's sort of full cycle. And Marina Bay Sands actually, changed my life professionally, because I designed a building that became an icon for a city. And that's when they had a call for proposal for that project. They said to the developers, we want something as iconic as the Sydney Opera House. That's a tall order. But,
right.
And there's a building that speaks for Australia through the architecture. And it happened with Marina Bay. But I didn't know it would happen, but it did happen. It is the symbol of Singapore. And in that sense, I think it's an important achievement.
So the counterpoint
to that. But now I feel bad about all the other buildings I love that I don't mention.
No, that you don't have to worry. But here is perhaps a question that is a counterpoint to that one. Which unbuilt project do you still dream of building?
I'd say two unbuilt projects. One that I didn't show you tonight, except one image, is the original habitat. And recently, Epic Games, the video game company, has digitized with our help the original habitat, which you can visit and walk through as if it's built. It's virtual reality. You can even walk into the apartments and see what's on the desk. It's so real. And when I saw it, that digitization, I said, this has got to get built yet. I know it's designed 60 years ago, but it's as meaningful today as it was 65 years ago. I think the other project is the Ballet Opera House in Toronto, which didn't get built.
Okay. Okay. Several people have asked you for this, have been very curious about this, and you can decide not to answer it. But the question really swirls around The Brutalist, and they'd like to know what your reaction to that movie was.
I went to see it.
Have you seen
it? This week. I went to see it, I think, this weekend, last weekend, because I kept being asked questions about it, so I figured I better see it.
Right.
I have to say that when people say about Habitat that it's a brutalist building, I get upset, because I don't think it's a brutalist building, and it didn't intend in any way. In fact, there were brutalist buildings being built when I did Habitat in India, Le Corbusier, and so on. We did everything we can to get the smoothest, nicest concrete, everything detailed and finished, because we were reacting to the kind of roughness. It's like Place Bonaventure with all the corduroy concrete that, that's brutalist. The film has some wonderful moments, and it does succeed in conveying the kind of drive that an architect experiences that manage to keep going and in spite of difficulties. But it's too long as a film. It should have you seen it?
I saw it, and I have to say, although it was long, when it finished, I thought to myself, I'd like to see this again, because
that's true.
I think it's like an onion, this film, and you start to unpeel the layers, and you want to go back and see it again. I found it quite fascinating in terms of, as well as the drive, the humiliations that we can be subject to.
Yeah, no, I think in that respect, it's right on.
This brings me to a question about broadening the topic a little bit by saying to you that your son Oren was one of my students at McGill, and he has, for the audience, decided not to practice architecture, but really to be a playwright, and he has been a very successful playwright in the United States. One of his early plays, Private Jokes, Public Places, is about a life in the School of Architecture, you could say, or the summary of the last review. And it really exposes both the misogyny and the abuse of power that exists in architecture. And this hooks into our Brutalist question, I think, in a way. So has the profession changed?
I think it has changed. Oren's first play takes place in academia.
Right.
And academia at the time was a notorious place of abuse and misogyny and so notorious. I think things have changed. I hope they don't change back now that we have Trump in power, because the woke movement has changed procedures, and I think the people who would be invited to reviews would be much more diverse today. It's very unlikely to get a jury of three egocentric men, as he described in the play. And I think that hitting on a young student, as they did in the play, would lead to dismissal today. So I think things have changed for sure. The other thing that has changed, which is more than half the students in architecture today are women, and that was not the case then. And that means that changes things because it just changes the whole mood of what happens in a classroom. So I think in that respect, we've made progress.
That's heartening to
Still
hear.
Still a lot to improve, but.
One of the questions that was asked by Marie-Claude was, you have written about the importance of site and geographical location in influencing the development of your designs. She would like you to expand on this. Although I think that the images that you've shown are quite compellingly supportive of this statement. But is there something more that you would like to add for Marie-Claude and the rest of us?
I'm giving 3 lectures at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard this spring semester. I do that. I've done this now 3 years in a row. I pick a subject and go into it in depth, 3 lectures, and then sort of a seminar. And this year I'm calling it the theme belonging. And so the lecture tries to emphasize in detail what I mean by that. First, the concept, or I'd almost call it the ideology of wanting to do a building that belongs. And that belonging means physical things, cultural things, belonging to a site, belonging to a culture, making people feel it's ours, identifying with it. And so I'd say that each project offers you specific things to work with. The program itself. If it's a museum, what kind of museum? The site, the prevailing sort of cultural. I mean, I'd say even I did the museum in Salem, and I did the museum in Savannah, 2 historic American cities, but still Savannah and Salem are worlds apart. One is the South and the climate down there, and the Peabody Essex in Salem is a cold place and a 19th century urbanism. There is subtle differences, I suppose, even between Montreal and Toronto, maybe not so subtle. So how you draw these into the design to give a building a sense of belonging without becoming kitsch, without becoming pastiche. I mean, we've seen architects, Western architects, go to the Middle East and do what they think is Oriental architecture, which, if it doesn't feel authentic, starts looking like pastiche. So it's a very important, delicate, complex subject. How to do it and how not to end up doing kitsch.
We only have a few more minutes, and I want to just ask you a couple of questions that seem to be able to be answered and just satisfy the curiosity of some of our listeners. One is that they are asking if there is going to be a retrospective of the scale that you had at the Skirball. Is anything coming up that you would like to tell us about?
I would love to have an exhibition now because there's so much new work. We haven't gotten one going yet. McGill were obligated to do it with the agreement on the archive that they would put. They haven't done anything yet.
Yeah, well, McGill's feeling, as you know, pretty under siege these days.
I'm feeling it.
I think an exhibition of your work would be an uplifting experience. Here's another question. My question is about Moshe Safdie's title of his book, If Walls Could Speak. It resonates deeply in my mind with the walls of Jerusalem. This wall hears. Did Mr. Safdie have the Jerusalem wall in mind?
I regret to say that the title was proposed by my publisher. First, I thought it was too curious, kind of. It sounded like gossip. They convinced me that it's okay. And I got convinced actually when the graphic designer with whom I worked for many, many years came up with a picture of my looking behind some wall. And I said, oh, with that picture, it works. So
I can see Farla on the screen, and Farla wants to conclude our discussion by saying something. Before that happens, I do want to say that buildings can wow us, buildings can provide us with shelter, they can provide us with environments for working and playing. But the two buildings that I can say in my long career of wandering around cities that have been both emotionally wrenching and yet uplifting are certainly the Museum at Yad Vashem and the Children's Memorial, which you did not speak of, but I find one of the most compelling buildings, the most compelling building I have ever been in. So I personally want to thank you, and I certainly want to thank you on behalf of all of this large audience that has been listening in on this Zoom. Thank you enormously. You have been gracious and giving of your time. And we are very happy to have attended this lecture. Farla just wants to say one last thing, and then I guess we will all say goodbye. Robin has, Farla, please go ahead.
Okay, so Moshe, I just want to tell you, I neglected to say it in my little introduction, that I went to visit Habitat a few weeks ago. I wanted to see, I hadn't seen it in about 50 years, and I was just overwhelmed when I drove by. It was a beautiful day, and the structure is just gorgeous. I mean, it's so original, so compelling, just love it. And the setting is so beautiful, and the water on one side and this view of the city on the other, which people have in their apartments, and just the whole idea of balconies and greenery, and it just was just beautiful. But I wanted to speak to somebody who lives there, and there was a lady walking on the property, and I asked her, how do you like living here? And she said, oh, madame, in French, she said, I just love it here. She says, I just love it. She says, c'est ma rêve. I think she said, mon rêve, yeah, it's my dream. She says, my husband and I have been living here for 16 years, and we are never going anywhere else. We're never moving out of here. And she said, then the only place that we're going after this is so that's going to be her end. And I just thought you would like to hear that story.
That's very moving.
And I just am looking at your book, and I see in the back what Yo-Yo Ma wrote. It's just beautiful. Can I read it to you?
Sure.
You've read it, but I just would read it to the audience. If walls could speak, it's not just about architecture. It's about a man in search of beauty, truth, and service to people through examining nature, the nature of the universe, and the nature of man. In this autobiography, Moshe Safdie succeeds in making the walls speak, revealing not only the depth, curiosity, and drive of a man with a mission, but also the challenges he faced creating extraordinary work for over 5 decades. Perhaps he says it best, if we seek truth, we shall find beauty. I was profoundly moved by reading this book, Yo-Yo Ma. Quite something.
Dear friend.
Wow.
Thank you.
Well, thank you too. We really.
Thank you, and thank you, Julia. Thank you all. Good night.
Good health.
Good night.
Good health.
Thank you.